Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. And today we're back with another episode of, whatever this is supposed to be. I wanted to tackle another topic, another somewhat controversial topic. Um, I promise you at some point we will get to something a bit more light and positive. I mean, at least I hope. But for this video, I want to talk a bit about DEI and how that what impact, for better or worse, that has on our stories, right? I want to keep the focus of this series of videos on storytelling because I've said a few times now, stories are a very critical component of the human experience, and it's something that we have to safeguard, right? And um, stories are a reflection of the culture, and the culture informs our stories. So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? I'm going to spend a bit of time first, just defining DEI, and then we can talk a bit about its impact, um, whether it's been effective or not, and whether it needs to be a thing, at all. And if it does, or at least the problem that it's attempting to solve exists, is there an alternative proposal to address that, right? So we'll go into a bit of all of that throughout the course of this video today. DEI, I mean, we all know the definition: diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I want to define it in terms of the context in which it's applied in media and entertainment and our stories, in general. Oh, I won't spend. I dislike using the terms like DEI and woke and things like that because I do believe we've gotten to the point where conversations are so polarized that we keep inventing these new slogans and terms and internet buzzwords to try to summarize something that is not, summarize and oversimplify something that is very complicated. And DEI is one such word because it's to the point now where it's just used to dismiss anything that has something that you don't like, as is the word woke. We're not having a conversation, unfortunately. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to use DEI so that things flow a lot smoother here. Right. So I won't spend too much time on equity and inclusion because my stance on that forthright is just it's equity and inclusion is absolute nonsense. I'll just come right out and say that. So I won't spend too much time on that because equity, how to put it succinctly, I suppose, life is not fair, right? Life is not fair, regardless of whatever religion you practice. According to those scriptures, the afterlife will not be fair either. So life isn't fair. If you've earned a position through merit, then there you go. If you haven't, then you're not qualified to be there and you're not equipped to be there. And what we have done with equity and inclusion is we've placed people in these critical positions. And while I'm speaking particularly about storytelling, this obviously applies to everything else. When you put people in positions where they're not qualified, where they're not equipped, the outcome is something, the quality of whatever it is you're producing declines. And that is what we're witnessing unfold now, where everything, if you've been the past, I would say maybe, 10 years, there's this feeling that everything just sucks. To put it simply, everything just sucks. And that is the reason why, right? Everything just feels vapid and fake, and and that's the result that you get, because if we're now operating under those terms where where we are trying to equalize things, and in doing so, there's no focus on passion. People are just being enlisted to fill up quota, and so you're noticing, slowly you're noticing that nothing is satisfactory. Everything just feels vain, because the people who are producing these things, they don't care. They're just pushed in a role. There's nothing there's nothing they're working toward there. There's no creativity, there's no imagination, there's no risk. Everything is safe and sanitized. And I've discussed before in prior videos that this is largely, as I've said before, this is going to be these videos will be having conversations that will be uncomfortable, but these are truths that we have to recognize. And part of the reason why everything is now safe and sanitized is because we've some feminized a lot of these processes that we've long relied on. So now everything is safe, it's sanitized, and with that, there's no risk taking. So you're not inclined to take risk anymore, and so everything feels same and repetitive, and it's just safe. So that is unfortunately the end result, where where equity is concerned. As I said, life isn't fair. If it is, regardless of your background, you can strive to be a better version of yourself tomorrow than you were yesterday. Now, for inclusion, it's a bit of a head scratcher as to why inclusion and diversity is there, because uh, it's, how to put it, I suppose inclusion is the prescription, and diversity would be the result. So inclusion is the prescription. So in order to be inclusive, or if you succeeded in being inclusive, you will have a diverse group. So the two being there, it's a bit redundant. But I suppose one of the reasons for having that is to have some equal or better representation for women and people who are disabled, and things of that nature, right? But again, it follows the same you know conclusion as equity that I've just gone through, right? We should not be filling quotas for inclusivity's sake. If it is that you have a goal in mind, you work towards it. You should be striving for equal opportunity, which is fine. But obviously the problem with that, at least from the perspective of the people arguing for inclusion, is that when you operate under equal opportunity, the end result typically is unequal, and that makes them uncomfortable. But that is the reality. Life is not equal, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. So that's my stance on equity and inclusion. At the very least, I think both are absurd, and I do believe striving for equity and inclusion is a sure way to ensure that there's a decline in our very social fabric, which we are witnessing unravel, as the years go by. Um, where diversity is concerned, I also disagree with it. At least in terms in principle, I disagree with it. But I do believe that there is a conversation to be had in terms of, why it was deemed necessary in the first place. And if it is that it was necessary, but the current approach is not, it's not working, what can we do to address those issues? Diversity. Yeah, this, I'm sure over the past few years, social media or otherwise, everyone has felt this push, and this applies to, I guess, equity and inclusion as well. That there's this push for, all these quotas to be filled in every avenue of our lives, right? It's in the food we consume, whether we are streaming something online, we go to the bank, whatever it is. We can feel that there's this hand, saying this should be the new norm. And I've always been a supporter of the proponent that change has to be organic. And I do believe whenever you try to force change in some way, it never works. It just doesn't. And so we've all felt it, that especially a lot of these corporations that control media and entertainment have been pushing this narrative that, this is the right way, and we know that this is best, and you must follow this. And so people rightfully are rejecting it. Diversity is typically, it's focused more around race, right? And for there to be some amount of representation, I'm not sure if the aim is equal representation per se. If it is, it's again absurd, because that is an impossibility, right? You cannot have an equal representation particularly if you live in a country where that doesn't exist. And so I've always found diversity a bit laughable, because in my mind, or at least factually, Black people in the US make up about what, 15, 16% of the total population, right? And so if it is that you're striving for equal representation, to have a 50-50 split there, then that's no longer equity. That's, you're no longer representing the population. If the majority are white people, then I would expect the majority of content to represent white people, right? And so that is my argument with those on, and I'm gonna do the thing that I said I don't like earlier in the video. This both sides of the equation, where okay, it's the woke side versus the anti-woke side, or the liberal side versus the conservative side. I hate that we're talking in these binary terms, but again, for the purpose of this video, we're just gonna have to, utilize that. So that is my argument with those on the liberal side, or the woke side, as they call it, is their intention, which arguably is not, it's not bad intentions, but uh, it's toxic empathy, right? And the need to see victimhood in every instance of life. And so because you're viewing things through that lens, you will never truly achieve equity, because there will always be something that is unequal. And so these people would, they'd never be satisfied. And what we would just happen is we would just be destroying our stories in the process. And so that's my largest argument there, being that equity, or trying to achieve equity in diversity, is just not possible. It isn't. And even if it was, if you did manage to, for our films and TV shows, and our, novels and so on, if you did manage to achieve, a 50% representation of whites, or Black, or Hispanic, or Asian, or whatever the case may be, it would not be equal, because the country is not equal. that begs the question whether, okay, let's say there is an unfair representation, or however they may perceive it, an unfair representation or overrepresentation of white people in, film and TV. Is that a bad thing? I don't believe it is bad, because the white people make up the largest portion of the population, at least within the US, and so they should represent the majority of the content that is produced. The problem lies, I suppose, well, at least in Hollywood, where they're now attempting to appeal to a global audience. And obviously, the global audience is not necessarily majority white, depending on what country you're in. And that's the dilemma there. Were you just appealing to the US, there's an argument to be made that, okay, things should be things should be majority white because you're representing mostly white people in the US. But when you go on a global scale, that's where the problem arises. And obviously, this comes from greed, because you don't have to you don't have to try to make films all the time to appeal to a global audience. You can just make a film that just appeals to the people within your country. It's something that's something that China does, because and they recognize the importance of stories, and ensuring that the people within their borders are their first priority. So those on the woke side, so to speak, there are several problems with their philosophy on diversity. But then there are some issues on the other side, the non-woke side or the conservative side. There are some issues on that end as well that's often not explored. And again, as I said, a lot of times this happens because we're speaking in such binary terms. People often don't feel a need to explore the position that they hold, or they don't need to even explain it. All they know is that this is our team, and our team is against the other team, and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if we have enough knowledge or agree with what our team represents. They're against the other team, so that's enough. And so there are a lot of issues on the non-woke side, the conservative side as well. One is to highlight this a bit. Obviously, we're in Black History Month. Something else that I despise. Why do we need a month to celebrate that? It's just ridiculous. But uh, regardless, we're in Black History Month, and so there are a lot of posts on Twitter, uh, celebrating these things that people had no hand in contributing. I find the whole thing absurd. But from time to time, I'll see posts by people who are more on the non-woke side, and they'll point to films like Lethal Weapon and Die Hard 2 to say, this is what diversity looked like before the woke crowd started to complain about it, or started to shove it down everyone's throat, because they have no nuance, and this is how it's usually done. But then when you examine the examples that they put up, it's Lethal Weapon, Danny Glover was basically a sidekick. It wasn't his movie. And I love the characters, but this is the reality. The same in Die Hard 2. Samuel L. Jackson's character was, again, a side character. This is Bruce Willis's film. We all know it's Bruce Willis's films, right? And so they point to all these characters who are just a footnote in someone else's story, and they think this is what diversity is, and should be. Black people being relegated to these secondary roles. And it points to some history that eludes them. These people who claim to be non-woke, where they've never really had to examine or explain the position that they hold. Because if they did and they examined it and looked at it clearly, they would understand that is not, that's not diversity, really. That's casting a token character so it doesn't look bad. And that's what it often comes down to a lot of times. And there's a reason for this, right? And even the people who cry that everything is DEI now fail to recognize that DEI has always been around. The only difference is now it's focused on sort of equalizing more representation of other races. But in the past, it was there, and in the past, it was used to ensure that white people were represented in media largely, right? We can examine there were a series of guidelines proposed by the motion picture production. I believe 1934, somewhere in the 1930s, but you can research this online. Information is all available there. And I believe they have a website where you can check this stuff as well. And they released several guidelines for film, and this was at the height of filmmaking when Europe was still recovering from a lot of decades of war, and so the U.S. had a head start when it comes to film and TV, and so they released a slate of guidelines that for production companies to follow, and in those guidelines it included there were several things, but one, the most notable, was that white people could not be depicted as slaves or subservient in any way. Now, if you're in the business of producing movies and you look at that, that is a quota, that is DEI. Someone is saying this is a list that needs to be checked to ensure white people are in certain positions. The DEI has always existed. And with all these guidelines, that one in particular was very important because it said that, okay, if you're a casting director or a producer on a film, or a director or a storyteller or a writer in that time, you're looking at that. All right, if I want my movie to be accepted and distributed, I must ensure that I cast white people in these heroic roles. Okay, nothing wrong with that. All right, now I need to find people to cast in the non-heroic roles, the dirty roles, the evil roles, the dregs, really. Now, who can I find to fill those roles? And the best choice would obviously be the black people who, at this point in time, weren't in the best position, they weren't. And they would be desperate to take whatever job was available to them for whatever price was available. And so during that time and the decades after, you would see, and you can look at the Oscar nominations and Oscar wins for the few decades after that, where the only roles where black people were winning anything is in a slavery movie, or playing a maid or some other subservient position. And it has a cascading effect as well, right? Because if you're a director, a writer, or a casting director, and you're trying to put this project together, you're going to do your best to try to avoid the ire of the people who make these regulations. So you're going to do everything you can to possibly to please those people, to ensure that your film has the best chance of success. And so we had decades go on where all black people were relegated to roles, not just slaves and the hell, but crack addicts. Of course, there was also a crack outbreak, and so it was fitting, I suppose. And gangbangers, and so that became the theme. And then once other producers saw that, everyone sort of ran with it and followed suit. So all the roles that were mostly available to those people were gangbangers, crack addicts, slaves, the help, and so on. And and again, while things have changed over the years, when we get to Lethal Weapon, for example, sure, they weren't the butler or the maid, but they were still secondary characters or sidekicks in a story, never the leading man, right? And we fast forward to today, we're still somewhat feeling the effects of that. And again, as I said, part of that is because the demographic of the U.S. is mostly white, and I'll reiterate this again. I do believe there's nothing wrong with having film and TV produced in the U.S. for the U.S. having majority white characters because that is the makeup of the population. I've said it at the start of this video that the stories are a reflection of the culture. And if the culture is predominantly white, then yes, the stories are and should be predominantly white. So I don't believe there's anything wrong with that. But it does beg the question, all right, what about these other people living there? Is it important for them to see that positive representation for themselves as well? Yes, I do believe there is a disparity there and a need for those characters to be seen differently. But I suppose, how do we try to accomplish that? And I think the answer is just equal opportunity. And just as the MPPC, in the 30s, sort of dictated that these are the specific groups that had to be in specific roles in these stories. We need to do away with that. I don't agree with filling a quota, which is what MPPC did. That was a quota. I don't believe we should do the same, which is what Hollywood is trying to do now. They're trying to fill another quota to correct what was done in the past. But what was done in the past wasn't good, and doing it now isn't good. So it seems they haven't learned a lesson from that, really. And even in trying to course correct, they're still making the wrong decision. So I don't believe there should be a quota filled to address this. I do believe there should be an an intent, but it needs to be organic. And I think the easiest way to achieve that is just to stop trying. I know that seems oddly not specific, but I mean, just stop. So just stop trying. Stop trying to fix the issue, and just don't have these rules barring people from entering certain roles. We can simply have casting calls for characters, just a broad casting call. You don't need to say, okay, we need white characters for this role if it doesn't require it. Obviously, if you're doing something specific, then you need majority white characters, then that's fine. But if you're doing some action flick or something that takes place in current time or the recent or recent history, you don't necessarily need, okay, this protagonist needs to be white. It's just not necessary. So you can have an open casting call for certain roles, and I know prejudice is not something that it's not something that we're going to get rid of ever. It's just not, and that's the reality of it. So, and in some instance, again, I know we want to. We're striving for this world that is fair and everything is great, but that world does not exist. That is a fantasy. The reality is that prejudice will always exist, and it exists on both sides. It's not just white against black, but also black against white as well. Prejudice will always exist. And to some extent, I believe it is actually necessary. That's a bold take to make in this time, but I said in the last video before that strife is necessary to tell a compelling story. And I do believe, whether how we may feel about prejudices and racism and so on, that is an obstacle for people to overcome. It is. And we've seen it. We've seen people overcome those obstacles and come out the other end. If you do look at the prominent black actors that we see now, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and so on, and they'll say, I remember, I believe it was, I think it was Lawrence Fishburne, perhaps. I think it was when he was talking about an interview where he was getting the role for Morpheus in the Matrix, right? A role which I believe the role of Neo was initially supposed to be cast using Will Smith, which thank God that didn't happen. Which thank God that didn't happen. But what Lawrence Fishburne mentioned was he was not initially intended to get the role because they had a quota on set that, or at least the studio had a quota that they could not have two black characters in key roles. So both Morpheus and Neo couldn't be black. Is what it came down to. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people seem to have been shocked by that. But again, these guidelines and DEI always existed there, and these quotas that okay, you can't have too many black people on set, or at least in key positions in these stories. DEI has always been there. The quotas have always been there. Anyway, he said he only got the role because Will Smith turned it down. Turned down the role of Neo, which then Keanu Reeves took up, and because Keanu Reeves took the role and he's white, then he was able to get the role of Morpheus because Morpheus was initially going to be a white character and Will Smith the black character, but they ended up flipping that because Will Smith turned it down. And so even then, Lawrence had to face that. All right, I only got this role because one black guy stepped out. And you've heard others speak about it. Samuel L. Jackson has spoken about it as well. From his perspective, he, in some of his interviews, where he said, at the time, only one of the three would really get a role, a large role in any film. It was either him, Morgan Freeman, or Lawrence Fishburne. It was one of three, and if one got the role, then he knew, okay, it's not. I'll need to wait before I get another act because they would only have one major black, one character in a key role at a time, so they kind of had to wait their turn, so to speak. And those are things that they had to face. But again, those are obstacles. They overcame those obstacles, and they are the men they are today that we see and revere as these brilliant actors. So, it's not to say that prejudice is good, but we all need motivations to get us to that point. And if that is the obstacle that someone needs to overcome, then I do not agree with robbing them of that. And our aim in trying to create this safe and perfect and sanitized society is, it's destroying our stories. It is. Because, again, I said fiction is necessary, but for great storytelling, but also friction is necessary to for us to tell good stories as well. There has to be some sort of friction to build the man that we need to come out on the other end. That we need to tell these stories. And so when you remove friction from the equation, and prejudice is one such friction, it's not the only one, but it is certainly one of them. You know, it could be height, could be friction. You know, a lot of people make fun of Tom Cruise for his height, but obviously that's something that he had to overcome to be a leading man in Hollywood. And here we are today. You know, he's one of the few great uh, movie stars that are still active. So that is, you know, my challenge with those with the non-woke group. They have this idea of what they perceive diversity to be, which is inaccurate, or they view these films through rose-colored lenses because of the time that they experienced it. So and it was good for them, so they believe it was good for everyone back in the 80s or 90s. But that wasn't diversity. That was just tokenism, right? And just putting characters in these positions because because the optics, what the optics would look like. So that's the issue on the non-woke side, and that's the issue on the woke side. Both are lacking in some way. And why would they need to look into the flaws in their argument, right? They're each so polarized that they believe themselves right. So what would be the solution here? We've identified issues on both sides. The the woke side attempting to create this world that is just pure fiction that does not exist, and destroying our stories in the process because filling quotas and putting people in positions that they didn't earn or they're not equipped to be in will only lead to the bastardization of our stories, and it never ends well. And we're seeing that now in a lot of the stories. I spoke about Star Wars and Star Trek in the last video, and that is, you can see how it led to that. All the boxes that they had to be checking for a Star Trek Starfleet Academy, even to the detriment of the story or the logic or flow of the story, because it made no sense whatsoever. But their priority was trying to check these diversity, equity, and inclusion boxes. That was their main priority. That was their goal, not to tell a good story. And also on the non-woke side, again, they don't particularly have a solution. They believe the past proposed a solution, which it didn't. And in the past, in fact, they utilized DEI at the time as well. So both sides are at an impasse, and neither are willing to give grace to the other because they each feel they have the solution. So, what is the solution? I believe I mentioned it earlier. I think it is just, I believe it's just equal opportunity. I believe it is as simple as equal opportunity. I recall this, I think it was Dev Patel. Yes, it was Dev Patel. I watched an interview with him recently where he was going over his film, Monkey Man, that he was trying to get distributed. And he told the story of how he was trying to get the film made. Of course, he couldn't get any companies to take it on to distribute it, and it was going to go to streaming. And I believe Jordan Peele um, worked with him to get it distributed in theaters. But in the making of the film itself, he recounted just how difficult it was for him to get the movie made. Obviously, Dev Patel is not black, but I believe he's Indian, so he's brown. They would face similar challenges. And he spoke about how, despite having an Oscar, because he was not, he won an Oscar at a very young age, and he built up all this prestige in Hollywood, and he's a very good actor. And when it came to to the time where he wanted to lead a film or get this project off the ground. He couldn't get the support he needed to get it done. And yeah, again, uncomfortable truths. We have to acknowledge the reason that probably wasn't possible is because he was brown, and because he wasn't white. Now, is there something wrong with that? Not necessarily, right? He was obviously approaching these American companies, and again, I've already discussed in this video, these companies are looking at this from a business and strategic perspective, and they're saying to themselves, okay, this is an Indian man attempting to make an Indian film to be distributed in the US, which is predominantly white and Christian. How exactly would that movie sell here? And that I cannot fault them for that. It's a logical question to ask, and it's a logical conclusion to come to say this probably isn't a good fit for us. The challenge I have is Hollywood has gone to the point now where everything has to be a major hit, or they will not take a risk on it, and that is where storytelling is going to die if that's the approach we're now taking. So while I agree that it would have been too big a risk for these companies to have a wide distribution for this film that may not appeal to their audience or their regional audience, it should still be possible for these small films to get made and succeed or fail by their own merits. Right? He should not have been roundly rejected by that many in order to get this film made, particularly because he had built up this prestige over the years where, okay, you should be able to take a risk on me. Right? And we have seen where this has happened before with white actors who companies are willing to take a risk on. Less so now than maybe 20, 30 years ago, right? But still, if Dev Patel had been white, odds are his chances of getting approval would have been a lot greater. That's just reality. And again, as I said, I don't disagree with the company saying, no, this is not appealing to our audience, but there should be a middle ground somewhere. There should be a smaller production company that would have said, yes, we will help you here, provide a budget, keep it under a certain figure here, and we'll help you get the movie distributed, not as a blockbuster, because we're not looking for a blockbuster movie, but as a small movie because it had a very small budget. And we're losing a lot of that. A lot of those middleware films that are not blockbusters and they're not indie, but they're somewhere in between. We've now gone from just indie films straight to blockbusters, and it's just one or the other, and otherwise nothing gets made. And I do believe that is a part of the problem there. Oh, Dev Patel did eventually get the movie made. He did, but he had to write, direct, and act the movie himself. And at some points, he had to shoot it with his iPhone because he had gone over the production time, and he had to be not taking a pay, and it was just as he described it, it was a bit of a disaster in terms of what you had to go through just to get it made, and that is a travesty in itself, right? That is a travesty. It's that difficult for particularly people of color to get something made, and again, as I said, it should be possible to succeed or fail on your own merits. I think companies are far too eager or more willing to take a risk on someone who is white and allowing them to fail than someone who is not. And as I said, I partly understand why, in that they're looking at the target audience for certain films and saying this is not worth the risk. But at the same time, if they're going for if Hollywood is trying to reach a global audience, they do need to, ensure that there is equal opportunity for these smaller films to get through. It is going to be necessary, and I do believe that is a solution. That we'll need to consider at some point, or fail. If that's where Hollywood is insistent on just continuing to check these boxes. And I don't know. We need, yes, we need equal opportunity, not trying to fill quotas by putting people in these positions that they ought to not be in. I On the TV show side, I was recently reading news about the Knights of the Seven Kingdoms that recently came out from HBO, and I think it's episode 5, right? And it was the scene that people appear to be a bit, or people find a bit contentious at the moment, is where the main character Dunk has a flashback with a girl that I believe she's his girlfriend. I haven't watched the episode. I've been holding off on watching this series because uh, a lot of my concern with anything that Hollywood puts out now is I don't know what they're going to put in it. So I'll just wait until it's done before I even consider it, because it's a bit of a mess at the moment. And they will inject all these messages, especially if you have kids. You have to wait before checking anything out. But the flashback had Dunk with this peasant girlfriend who this appears to be of mixed race, and obviously people are looking at that and asking, why is this girl here? And there are people of mixed race in Martin's world, so that was part of the issue that people had. The other part is how the young woman treated Dunk. But it all culminates into the same problem that we're discussing, where um, they have this story, and there's this character, I'm told, is in the books, but she's just briefly mentioned, and they've added this entire scene for one, making her biracial, and two, having her have this insufferable boss girl characteristic that now needs to wag her finger at Duncan and call him a fool, and essentially emasculate him. And then they're a bit surprised when these quotas that they're filling receive backlash, when this wasn't in the book. So someone decided to add that, and decided that this would be her character and her personality, and thought this would have been a good thing. Right, so I pointed that just to highlight that the problem is not just in filmmaking, but also TV as well. Where one, given that her and Dunk are from the same place, she could have been white. I'm not sure why she's biracial. And secondly, why she couldn't have been a pleasant, feminine young woman who is loving and supporting of Dunk, instead of berating him and treating him like an incompetent fool. So the problem, it seems to exist in all mediums, unfortunately. And this is again all about checking a box. We need her to be biracial. We need her to be a strong boss girl, and all these things. But yeah, it's the box checking, the quotas for the sake of DEI. It's just and it's a shame, because it's immediately calling out these people to say this is a DEI scene being shoved in. And had this young woman been mixed race, because I think the people from the Summer Isles are in George's world are mixed, or black, or whatever the case may be. But had she been a pleasant young woman who was feminine and treated Dunk well, the backlash would not have been as large as it seems to be. But there's just this need to to force these quotas, and and have these characters be a specific way that just ends up rubbing people the wrong way, and people rightfully reject it. And I fully understand why they would now reject it. So there's been this over the past year or so, this, this idea of black fatigue that's been trending in certain spaces. And this is what they're talking about. And it's funnily enough, it's not so much, you know, the woke crowd likes to point to the anti-woke crowd and say that they're racist. But if you listen to what these people are saying, obviously they're going to be extremists in some places, both on, well, either side of the aisle. But if you listen to what these people are saying, I've looked at a few of these black fatigue videos to sort of understand the positions that they're holding. And the consensus seems to not be that they have an issue with black people being in media and entertainment so much as the type of black people that's being depicted in media and entertainment. And that, if you examine that and don't go in with an open mind to try to understand the position that they are coming from, it makes a lot of sense, because there are certain principles and certain values that you want characters to have in these stories, and the black characters that they're choosing to inject in these stories lack all those things, right? And it speaks to a broader cultural issue, which you know mostly infects the US because they're Hollywood is a movie making machine, and that's where we're seeing most of it. And unfortunately, because if you're in Asia or some other country where you don't have a huge black population, your first encounter with black people will most likely be a Hollywood movie. And because these are the characters that Hollywood is choosing to put out, it's creating this image that people have of black people in their heads. And obviously, again, as I said, the black culture, there's no such thing as black culture, but you know, the black Americans in the US hold some responsibility because you know the culture there that they allow to rise to the top, with just degeneracy all around. That is what keeps getting highlighted in the media. The people there hold some responsibility for it. We all own a responsibility for how our culture is depicted and what we choose to highlight and what we choose to share with the world. Even just the people who will turn on their camera on YouTube and record something absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, so it's all a part of it. It's a wider cultural issue, which probably an entire video all on its own that I would need to investigate. I would need to create an entire video on that, on black culture, the black community, because I think both are nonsensical. Black people are not a monolith, but perhaps that's something worth exploring in a separate video. So the main issue, from the anti-war crowd is not so much black people in media, but how black people are being used in media. And when you look at it from that perspective, or listen to what they say, you do understand why they reject what Hollywood is putting out. And yeah, Hollywood these people lack the self-awareness to address this issue. They live in a bubble for the most part. And even those who go in with good intentions rarely remain that way. And so, again, as I said, I think from the only solution that would make sense here is just, equal opportunity, so that, some people can get in and tell good, positive stories. I think Ryan Coogler is one such good example, at least for the moment. Who knows? As I've said, sometimes people go into Hollywood with good intentions, and after a few years, what's a disaster. But so far, his filmography, appears to be going in the correct direction. I think he started with Fruitvale Station, and I haven't seen it. I haven't seen Privilege Station, but I do hear that it's good. And what I like when I read about him is, he tries to surround himself with all these people who are like-minded. And I think the guy who does the score for many of his movies, I think it's Ludwig Göransson. You know, someone he met in college, and they both love movies, and they've just been working together since. And these are the good, positive stories that you want to hear when it comes to storytelling, and just friends coming together to create something beautiful, right? Something beautiful and something memorable and something positive. So those are the stories that we want to hear. In Coogler's example, he was able to get Fruitvale Station made, which is good. But again, Coogler is just one person. Is one young director, or in one young black director in decades, right? So we seem to have a few every few decades, but come on, there's obviously a barrier there, but I won't say that it's purely systematic. I do think, again, as I've said, it's partly a cultural issue that Black Americans do need to solve. So it's both, we both need there to be equal opportunity for those people who are interested, but it also needs to be fostered from the home and in the culture that, okay, for kids to start writing these stories, get your kid a cam, not a smartphone with all the distractions. Get your kid a cam to start making, home videos to get them interested in stuff like that. Get them reading. I cannot stress that enough. Get them reading. So the issue is in my mind twofold. One, it's systematic, and the other is cultural. Um, you know, both. I do believe will take time to get to a point where we can have good stories with characters of color without it, feeling like it's a DEI situation. And Hollywood needs to stop this box checking that it's doing, race swapping and all that, because it does not help. If anything, it just makes the problem worse, because what happens now is people now expect the content to be bad when they see a black person in it, and that is partly because of what Hollywood has been doing. Because you're putting people in these roles that they don't belong, because you're putting people in these who are not equipped, or they can't act, or they can't write, and you're putting these people in positions. People by default now assume that once they see a black person, or there's a black person on the team, that it's just going to be trash. So that's a problem. That is a problem, right? So the issue is unfortunately not something that will be possible to resolve overnight. But we do see positive change happening, and I don't know. I hope that as time goes on, once we have more people of color in, not just in front of the camera but behind the camera as well. And we have had a few good storytellers in the past in things like comics, for example, or even video games. But yeah, it's unfortunately it's different times now. I think it would have been far easier to address this issue maybe 20, 30 years ago. But because we're now in such a polarized world, it becomes everyone has a loudspeaker, and everyone believes that they have something that is worth saying, and it becomes divisive. And because you spend that much time just being divisive, you're not spending a whole lot of time trying to actually work to address the issue at hand. All right. So I'm still hopeful. I'm still hopeful. Yeah, I think we can get there. I do think we can get there. And hopefully we'll one day get to the point where DEI is just a bad memory, and just a bad memory. And I think part of what will need to happen is, for a lot of these stories that we're telling, the we're limiting ourselves to specific genres, right? And obviously, there's usually a pushback when people see Black people in fantasy, um, which to some extent I can understand if it is that you're telling something that is close to being to realism, a period piece or something to that effect. I can understand why it would be jarring to see a Black person there, but not entirely though, because again, this is part of my issue with the non-woke crowd. It's they somehow believe that Black history started after slavery, failing to recognize that Africa is a continent, and the continent has been trading with Europe for centuries. What they when they think Black people, they think of West Africa and just slavery, forgetting that there's other parts of the region that was already, trading with Europe effectively. If you read, about some of the Greek philosophers and engineers and so on who traveled to Egypt to learn and trade with each other. So again, it's just a lot of knowledge seems to be getting lost in the noise. And so these people, when they think Africa, they just think, okay, if there's a Black person there, then that person should have been a slave during that time. No, there are other parts of Africa that had people of varying, colors, so to speak. Uh, so it becomes a bit muddy and confusing when you start having that conversation. But I can understand if you're telling a specific story in a specific region in Europe, why, it would be jarring to have a Black person there. But in general, depending on the time period that you're in, you can have Black people there, just not in any large amounts, because that would be a bit ridiculous. But Europe would have been trading with certain parts of Africa at some point. Um, but then when we get to high fantasy, then it gets a bit absurd because this is purely fictional, and so I've not really had an issue with that. But we have other genres that no one is really looking to, like science fiction, for example. I don't think I can only recall one film, one science fiction film that had a Black lead. Blanking on the name, but it had Denzel Washington's son as the lead character. But we don't have a whole lot of those, and I think people are nostalgic for the past. So a lot of the stories that we're seeing getting told are written about the past, and there's just no creativity into dreaming about the future anymore. And I hope some of the Black creators coming up, or white creators, it doesn't even matter, because there's this idea that only Black people can tell stories with Black people, and I think that's just utterly ridiculous. We've had some great Black characters in like comics and so on that have been created by white writers. So I don't think that's a requirement. But again, as I said, we've gotten to the point where everything is just binary now and polarizing, and it's just ridiculous. Um, but I do think there's an opportunity there to focus less on the past and more so on the future, and trying to tell some of those stories, because the thing that we seem to have lost now is that we're, Isaac Asimov was in his time dreaming of what the future would look like, and that helped him to write the stories that he did. But today we don't seem to be dreaming of the future anymore. We seem to be content with the present, and that is an unfortunate thing. Yeah, but yeah, I think I'll leave it there. The video is running a bit long, and I'm just ranting at this point. But I do hope that we at some point get to the stage where we can have these characters of diverse race and creed being told, where it's not not an issue, but it will involve having conversations, some uncomfortable conversations, but mostly there needs to be a cultural change, and there needs to be, you know, an effort toward equal opportunity for people, regardless of race, to get in, not just in front of the screen, but also behind in the writer's room as well. But I do believe that in our current time, the cultural issue will be the largest hurdle that we need to overcome. And that may take some time for us to get there, but I am confident. And I think my proposal here would be the same as it was in the last video, which is pick up a pen and pencil and start writing. All right. Thank you everyone for stopping by. And I'm not sure when another video will be coming out. These videos have been sort of, well, not sort of, they've just been random whenever I, have something that I think is worth mentioning or talking about. And I'll just, set up the camera and start talking. So I'm not sure when the next one will be, but thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you for the next one.